there we are, Brian. Today we have Brian Wright. Brian is the author of the new book that was just released yesterday, The New York Mets All-Time All-Stars. I stayed up all last night reading it. It's awesome. So everybody go out there and get it. We'll put the links up for you. It was released from Lions Press, features a full roster of players, a manager, coaches, and front office. He also wrote Mets and Tens, Best and Worst of Amazing History, examining the team's highs and lows through a series of top 10 lists. And you were the managing editor for Met Retrospectives, a publication from the Society of American Baseball Research, SABR, which chronicles the greatest games in franchise history. You've also contributed to other SABR books, including the most memorable moments in the history of the San Diego Padres, Wrigley Field, and Old Comiskey Park. And you currently reside in Washington, D.C., as we just talked about. So welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. Great to be on.
So anybody who knows me knows I'm a huge Mets fan. Plus, I love doing podcasts. So when I saw your book was coming out, I think I saw it on Twitter. You're pretty active on Twitter.
Yeah.
I had to talk to you.
No. I love hearing from fans, hearing from voracious readers like yourself. By the way, you read the book a lot faster than I could possibly read it.
Yes. Well, I do want to go back through it. I kind of, the way I read books is fast, so I'll read them 2, 3, 4 times to digest everything. How did you get involved in writing about baseball?
I have as you might expect, I've always had a lifelong obsession with it, specifically with the Mets since I was about 5 years old. Had always been interested in the history of baseball around since then, and had. My dad had all these old books, old videos, specifically of the Mets, and it kind of carried on from there. I would go to, in high school, I would go to journalism class and worked on the student newspaper, and then in college was a communication major and worked on the student newspaper. And even as I kind of went into my career, which wasn't totally sports related, I always wanted to still keep my toe in the water, so to speak. And write in sports, and I've written for several websites, and you had mentioned other things that I had done, with SABR, and I always wanted to kind of have some kind of involvement in doing sports, even if it might not be a career. So as I was writing for some publications, I did a lot of list writing and kind of top 10 lists, and that's what partially inspired me to do that Mets and Tens book with Arcadia Publishing and the History Press. So that kind of was the foundation for starting that book, which came out about 2 years ago. And my involvement with SABR allowed me to kind of oversee that Metrospectives book, and carried on from there. And the editor, main acquisition editor at Lions Press saw specifically Mets and Tens, wanted to see if I'd be interested in doing this book, the All-Time All-Stars. They've also done books on the Yankees, which came out last August, and the Pirates, which also came out yesterday. So I was happy to do it. It was a tough process because it was writing the book in a short period of time. I think I would rather had a few more months, but to do it in about less than a year was a lot of work. But it was a subject matter that I was fully aware of. I think it had been another team, it would not take me. I wouldn't have done it that quickly.
When you wrote your first book, anybody who's listening out there who wants to write a book, that's not just an easy task when you just wake up one day and you want to write a book. Mm-hmm. Could you explain that process to everybody?
Yeah, it requires a lot of patience and diligence. When people ask me if you must be such a great writer, and I'm trying to remember what it is, and I've said this in other interviews. I was watching those masterclass things. You get them, they spam your Facebook and your social media. I was watching one of them, and I believe it was Margaret Atwood who did Handmaid's Tale. I think it was her. I don't want to totally say it was her, but she said something. It was definitely a woman. Said something to the effect of, "I'm not a great writer. I'm a great rewriter." And I would say I'm not a good writer. I think I'm a good rewriter. What I mean by that is, my advice to anyone who wants to do a book or wants to write something long form is to have a long-term plan, and to make sure that plan includes writing every day if you can, whether it's writing 500 words, 1,000 words. If you don't have a lot of time, write 200 words. Just write something down, It doesn't have to be perfect. You don't have to have your perfect sentence, your perfect paragraph right away. I am certainly an example of that. I write something down. I have an idea. I say, if it's the Mike Piazza chapter, I want to write about, hey, how he, the trade that brought him to New York. That's how I want to intro it. And I put something down, and I eventually look at it again and go, it stinks. I got to correct it. And then I might look at it later and say, well, I got to correct it again. So it's a lot of repetition. As I said, trying to write every day and making sure you have that long-term plan and sticking to that plan. Probably the most difficult part is sticking to that plan, because if you skip a day, then it's a week, then it's a month, and then you miss the deadline that the publisher gives you. So my main piece of advice is to write every day and to not always search for that perfect sentence or paragraph, because you're never going to find it the first time.
And even when the book is written, so your job's not done. Like today, you're doing interviews, and I saw you on a couple of other podcasts. And what else are you required to do after you write that book, or is good?
Yeah, well, publishers, as many people might know, they're not exactly lucrative. So the resources they may have for a writer to promote their book is a little bit limited, and I think that's something that I've understood, especially after the first book. And so a lot is required of you to promote your own book, and I happily take that on, because I like to be in control of a lot of things. So although it's difficult, but there's also a lot of fun in it. There's a lot of fun in people saying, hey, I really, like I read the book, and hey, I really like it. We can converse about it, and people say, hey, maybe, this position, I thought this should have been different. But hey, I really liked it. I enjoy that, because I don't expect what I write to be agreed upon by everyone. Otherwise it'd be a really boring book. So yeah, I enjoy the promotional part of it. It's tough. It's a little bit stressful. Sometimes you arrange interviews and you realize you just kind of put two on top of each other, and it's hard to be kind of a writer and also a scheduler at the same time. So it's I guess this is the most enjoyable part, is talking about your work and seeing how many people want to talk about it with you.
Cool. And we're at a great time of the year. So the Mets are in spring training. Baseball's about to start. The weather still stinks, but this gives hope to all Mets fans every spring. So and I bring that up. So I'm a Mets fan. You're a Mets fan. We must be gluttons for punishment.
Right.
If you're not a Mets fan, you don't really understand why people are so passionate about them. Why the Mets for you?
Pretty easy for me. My dad was a Mets fan growing up. He's been a Mets fan since 1962, and although his fandom isn't as strong as it was since in his later years, I feel like I've taken that on and probably taken it to the nth degree in terms of my obsession. Anyone who's a friend of mine knows pretty much, if they want to describe me, that's usually the first word they would use to describe me, would be like, oh, Mets fan. So it's pretty easy to kind of point me out and to describe me. So I went to my first game when I was about 5 years old in 1992, and it pretty much was an obsession from there on out. Even though I live in Washington, D.C., I try to go up to Citi Field whenever I can, and of course, when the Nationals are here, I'll watch the Mets as well, and of course, I try to watch every game on MLB TV through SNY. So it's a family heirloom, so to speak, passed down from, I think, my grandfather was a Brooklyn Dodgers fan, passed on, and then became a Mets fan when they started to exist. My dad took them on from the start, and then he passed it on to me. So hopefully that never changes through our family history.
I've never considered it, but it gets tough sometimes. But I'm hopeful this year. I think we have a good team going. So let's jump into the book. Let's start right with pitching. So the Mets have had really strong pitching over the years, but I guess the top two. I mean, you can't really argue with your choices there. Could you talk about Tom Seaver and Jacob DeGrom?
Yeah, no, it's interesting now. Tom Seaver is he's called the franchise for a reason, and he'll be the franchise as long as there is a Mets franchise. No one can surpass his impact on the Mets. I mean, obviously the statistics are fantastic. He leads pretty much in every category, but it's interesting to see how Jacob DeGrom is making a case statistically. I don't think he can never reach Tom Seaver's impact in terms of changing the attitude or changing the perception of a team. Because when Tom Seaver came along in 1967, I mean, the Mets were a doormat. And Tom Seaver had the attitude that they weren't going to be that. And he showed it on the mound. He showed it off the field. And of course, the Mets became world champions 2 years later. And, the rest is history. Jacob DeGrom, through his first 6 years compared to Tom Seaver's first 6 years, if you look at statistics that kind of even out the time period, because it's so hard to compare eras because of Seaver's workload, and of how many, just the way baseball is in the 1960s compared to how it is today. If you look at stats like ERA plus and WHIP specifically, Jacob DeGrom is slightly better through 6 seasons. Now, of course, that's only 6 seasons. We still have a ways to go in Jacob DeGrom's career, hopefully all with the Mets. But it's fascinating because I put up a tweet kind of last week to kind of honor Tom Seaver because he's on the cover. And I said, well, I just want to do a little comparison and see how, Jacob DeGrom compares with Tom Seaver. Obviously, no Met has ever won back-to-back Cy Young, so Jake is kind of in a class by himself in that regard. But I was fascinated that the first 6 seasons of Jake's career, he's a little bit better in terms of those stats. Still, again, not going to match Tom Seaver. And it's a fruitless effort or fruitless thing to ask of Jacob DeGrom to try to do that because he can't. But it's really remarkable to see that how far Jacob DeGrom has come, and that maybe he has another Cy Young award in him, and he would match Seaver with 3. Even if that happens, it's an interesting argument. But Seaver, again, impact resonates so much in terms of how I feel a player is regarded in their history.
And you think about the Mets, you think of Tom Seaver. Now, Jacob DeGrom came out of, I don't want to say virtually nowhere, but he wasn't as heralded as Noah Syndergaard or Zach Wheeler, or, you go down the list, down years before. Jason Isringhausen, Bill Pulsipher, all those guys. So, how does anybody predict something like that? He's now one of, if not the best, one of the best pitchers in baseball.
Yeah, no, you can't predict something like that because we've seen all these pitchers that get highly touted and go up through the minor leagues, and how the projections of how great they're going to be. And as you had pointed to, it's in that group in 2014, in the 2013, 2014, 2015, of all the great pitchers that were going to come up to the Mets. We talk about Matt Harvey, Zach Wheeler, Noah Syndergaard, Rafael Montero. That didn't work out too well. No one talked about Jacob DeGrom. Jacob DeGrom begins his Mets career pretty modestly. A game against the Yankees, I believe in May of 2014. I think he gave up 1 run and lost. So, it was a portent of things to come. But, goes on to win Rookie of the Year. 2015, he's an all-star, really important in the World Series run. And then, of course, the back-to-back Cy Young season. So it's funny, Jacob DeGrom was no one talked about him and among that group. And not only is he's the best of that group, he's one of the best Mets pitchers in history.
Right after those first 2. So I'd imagine you maybe had a tougher time right after that with Dwight Gooden and John Matlack and Jerry Koosman. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, no, Dwight Gooden is an easy choice, I thought, and Jerry Koosman, of course, is an easy choice. He'll get his number retired later this year. It got a little bit tougher when you got to Ron Darling, who was kind of the Koosman to Dwight Gooden's Tom Seaver, if you want to compare those 2 eras. John Matlack was kind of the third fiddle behind Seaver and Koosman, and in some respects he was a little bit better than Koosman, but he kind of gets forgotten because he was Jacob DeGrom before Jacob DeGrom. If you look at how little run support, I think I cited it in his intro, specifically in 1974, he got no run support, had a pretty average record. His ERA was fantastic, never got a Cy Young consideration. But he was a guy whose win total does not reflect how good he was. for the Mets. Of course, winning the 1972 Rookie of the Year, I mean, great year in '73, and as we talked about '74, and overall had a pretty good Mets career. And this year will get inducted into the Mets Hall of Fame, and deservedly so. But as you got down the line, and one thing I made sure to do, and you alluded to this, is that the Mets have had a lot of great pitchers, specifically starting pitchers. And one thing I made sure to do, and I got a little creative with the 30-man roster that I put out, was that I had 7 starting pitchers. I didn't want to leave out very deserving pitchers, and they've had a greater despair. They've had many more great starting pitchers than relief pitchers. So I made sure to throw in 7 starting pitchers, 3 relief pitchers. But even then, with 7 starters, it was hard to leave a few people out. The ones in honorable mention, I was still debating whether I should put them in the team as opposed to the other pitchers. So that's the difficult part with picking this team, because there are some positions in which players that got included maybe aren't as good or impactful in Mets history as some of the pitchers I had to leave off.
Who did you leave off? Who did you agonize over?
So the 2 pitchers that I agonized over were starters, and they were David Cone and Sid Fernandez. David Cone obviously had a great start to his Mets career. 1988, he was 20-3 and was pretty much the ace of that staff, just out of nowhere, because I think he was a kind of a spot starter. He was kind of used in relief, and then he kind of had to go in an emergency, I think, in May of '88, and went on to that fantastic season. Led the league in strikeouts, I believe, in 1991, and had a 19 strikeout game. But it was just a little bit short of all of the 7 pitchers I had. That's no shame on David Cone. He still was a great pitcher. And Sid Fernandez, has the lowest ERA, I believe, in Shea Stadium history. Put together some really good years, a lot of strikeouts. He didn't always have quite the stamina to last deep into games, and that hurt him in the era he pitched. If he was pitching today, he might be an ace, because who goes more than 7 innings today? But I tried to judge these players in the era they were performing, and kind of tried not to say, hey, if I were to put a team together today, who would I put? Because that's a slippery slope. So in that respect, I had to leave Sid Fernandez off. Again, no shame in how Sid Fernandez did. He was a great pitcher for the Mets, was very important, and probably the MVP of Game 7 of the '86 World Series, coming in relief of Ron Darling and kind of stabilizing the Red Sox offense. But again, he falls just a little bit short of making the pitching list.
Who is not in the book that just didn't make the cut at the pitcher position for you?
I mean, there were when I put the honorable mention together, I tried to kind of put different pitchers from different eras. So the honorable mentions are not in the case of Cone and Fernandez, are people that they are pitchers that just missed. But I trying to, for the sake of brevity, I didn't want to list every pitcher that I was they're certainly, they have their qualifications. Guys like Johan Santana, who had the no-hitter, had a very good 2008. I remember he had a great second to last game of the season that kept the Mets in the playoff race, and had a lot of great moments. Of course, injuries really harmed his Mets career. Maybe another guy like Billy Wagner, who was a pretty good reliever, had some tough moments in the 2006 playoffs, but overall had some fine years as a closer. I believe made at least one All-Star game. So he was another pitcher that I just never put on there, but certainly would be a respectable honorable mention.
Okay. All right. Let's move on to catcher. So obviously the Mets, you think of the Mets again, you think of Gary Carter. He was just such a huge personality, was in the spotlight all the time. You want to talk about the catcher position?
Yeah, no, I made sure to, Gary Carter definitely, Mike Piazza definitely, but I made sure to put 3 catchers because I think Jerry Grody is deserving of being put on this team. If you look at his you look at the box score, if you look at his Baseball Reference entry in terms of his hitting, it's never going to stand out. It does not compare to Mike Piazza's power numbers. It doesn't compare to the RBIs that Gary Carter put up. But the importance that he had to to helping mature and kind of harden the pitching staff of 1969 can't be overstated. He was kind of rough around the edges, to say the least. He really got on his pitching staff, but it worked to great effect. And when Gil Hodges, the manager of the 69 Mets, built that team or kind of constructed that team, he would always emphasize strength up the middle when that comes down to catcher and Jerry Grody, the pitcher, and of course he had a lot of great ones, shortstop, but with Bud Harrelson, and center field with Tommy Agee. And that was defensively was so vital to the success of the 69 Mets, both in limiting the opposition from scoring runs. And Jerry Grody was really the heart of that, of not only, as I said, molding the pitching staff, but also making sure that runs weren't scored. So I wanted to make sure that he would not go unrecognized in terms of his importance. I think I mentioned in one of the lines of the book, Johnny Bench, who was regarded as not only the greatest catcher of the 70s, but one of the greatest catchers of all time, who said that if Jerry Grody was a Cincinnati Red, he'd be a third baseman.
Does Todd Hundley not get forgotten, but does he have a little tarnish on him because of the Mitchell report and the chemical use claims?
Yeah. He does, but I think it's with, as you're saying, with a lot of the steroid guys. I think the Barry Bonds and the Roger Clemens, they may well get to the Hall of Fame one day. And as personally, I would say they deserve it, but I think they probably should get in, and the steroid era should be recognized and put in proper perspective. So in the case of Todd Hundley, he certainly has his place, or had his place, in Mets history. He had the most home runs in a single season, tied with Carlos Beltran, until Pete Alonso did it just last year. And surprising to many Mets fans, he has the most home runs of any Met in the 1990s. So he does have a place in Mets history. I don't want to come off as saying a lot of people did it, but the steroid era, we're going to have to put into perspective, and recognize that the steroid, we can't really, parse down who took steroids, who was on performance enhancing drugs, and who wasn't. So to answer your question, yes, but at the same time, he was a great power hitter for the Mets in the 1990s, and you can kind of put your own asterisk on it, if you will.
And the other the catcher that you mentioned, I'm glad you did, is John Stearns. Now, he was on some Mets teams that weren't very good, but if anybody who knows John Stearns knows he was, hard as nails.
He kind of supplanted Jerry Grody at catcher, and I believe in terms of WAR, his WAR is a little better. That being said, I had to put Grody over Stearns. Stearns, I think, made 3, 4, 5 All-Star, maybe made 4 All-Star games, if I'm not mistaken. And as you said, those were for some pretty bad Mets teams, but he still was deserving of those All-Star selections. Was pretty fast, actually, for a catcher. I don't know exactly how many stolen bases he had, but more than most catchers would produce.
That's a great question. So in your book, there's a lot of stats. How do you personally keep track of all these stats, as you're writing a book? Because people can real easily just go check all your stats that you write down and be another editor for you.
Yeah, no, I was pretty much my own editor, going through the first time and writing the manuscript with all those stats, and having to then look back and make sure I did it correctly, because some of the stats you can get right off the bat on Baseball Reference, and some I actually went a little deeper and said, hey, this guy had a 350 batting average from August 4th to September 30th or something like that. It kind of made my double checking a lot harder, and almost made me go, oh, why did I go this deep? Because now it's just making me more work for me. But I kind of wanted to give the proper lens to how impactful or how important these particular players were. And I think sometimes if you say, hey, this person was great down the stretch, and here's an example of that because late in the season they hit a certain number, or they got on base this often, or they were so good at throwing runners out, maybe as far if you're talking about a catcher, or their ERA was this low if you're talking about a pitcher. So a lot of baseball reference. I will give them a lot of credit for helping me out. Fan graphs. I also used another site I used was ultimatemets.com, which is just if Mets fans have not gone to it, they should, because maybe they shouldn't go right now because you'll not get it. You won't get any work done. But it's you can spend a lot of hours on ultimatemets.com and have a lot of fun with it.
Cool. All right. First base. I guess it really wasn't too much of a question. Keith Hernandez was your choice.
Yeah.
Great fielder. I mean, he was one of my favorite players at first base. I mean, if you want to emulate somebody, he was the guy to do it for defense.
Was.
What do you think of him?
Yeah, I think he was not only important in terms of just the fielding, won 6 of his 11 straight Gold Gloves with the Mets. The first few were with the Cardinals. And that trade from the Cardinals to the Mets is the best trade the Mets ever made. We all talk about how many bad trades the Mets have made. That was not only a good one, it was the best one. It changed the attitude of a franchise that was pretty dormant. And Hernandez was very important in reversing that attitude, kind of being the leader in the clubhouse. But not only was his fielding important, he was a great hitter, has the best batting average of any Met that's had at least 3,000 at bats. But as I was just talking about, his leadership really just helped elevate the Mets from being a perennial basement feeder to a contender. So in that sense, I mean, Keith Hernandez is one of the most important players the Mets have ever had.
What are the Hall of Fame chances there? I mean, I would think he's very deserving.
Yeah, I'd always thought that he wouldn't get in. I would have thought that a few years ago, and I don't like to be that kind of person that says, "Well, if that guy gets in, well, why isn't this person getting in?" But the more I see who gets into the Hall of Fame, players that were very good, but would not consider them Hall of Famers, and I would then start to think maybe Keith Hernandez would get more consideration. The comparison I make is to Bill Mazeroski. Bill Mazeroski was probably the greatest fielding second baseman ever, and had, of course, the unforgettable home run in 1960 to beat the Yankees. Keith Hernandez is the greatest fielding first baseman ever. Certainly a better hitter than Bill Mazeroski was, and Keith Hernandez didn't, have that ultimate postseason moment, but he had 2 very, very, very important hits in the World Series in Game 7s. When you talk about 82 with the Cardinals, I believe he broke by, or maybe it took the lead. I can't remember. But it was an important hit, and then almost duplicating that with a hit for the Mets in Game 7 against the Red Sox. It was a 3-0 game. Bases were loaded. He gets a hit to left center, drives in 2. The Mets eventually tie the game, and of course they go on to an 8-5 win. So I look at that and say maybe Keith Hernandez is a better shot than I would have believed a few years ago.
Hopefully. I always loved him. So the Mets have had some pretty good first basemen. So who are your other considerations there and choices?
There are a lot of people, a lot of first basemen to choose from. I think the nominees you could say definitely are John Allrood, Ed Kranepool, Carlos Delgado. In the book, I mentioned Pete Alonso because I just thought it deserved to be thrown in there. And you can't, no one can predict what's going to happen 2, 3, 4 years from now. But Pete Alonso is on a trajectory that would certainly get him on an all-time team, maybe 5 years from now or less, because it was such a remarkable season. Not only what he did in the 53 home run, but
he had a knock on him that his defense was not very good. But I watched, if not every game last year. I mean, his defense was pretty above board.
Yeah, no, it's very good. I didn't see him at all as a liability.
Let's go into second base. You picked again one of my favorite players is Edgardo Alfonso, who could hit the heck out of that ball and put it anywhere he wanted to, opposite field. How was your selection at that position?
Yeah, that was very easy for the starter with Edgar Alfonso. He's one of my favorites as well. Clutch hitter, steady fielder. He at the beginning of his career he kind of moved position to position. He started, I think, as a third baseman, then moved to second. I think they may have used him at shortstop, and eventually he settled on at second base, and that was a great spot for him. And if not for like the back injuries, I think he could have added to his Mets legacy. But after him, it was a very interesting choice. I went with two more. And in an earlier podcast, someone asked me, was there a player that I initially made a list and said, oh, that person's not going to make the team. And then eventually I realized, oh, I guess he is. That person's Daniel Murphy. And we talk about polarizing figures in Mets history. I don't know if he's the most polarizing, but he's certainly up there. And I think his time after the Mets has really kind of added some interesting layers to his Mets legacy. But from whatever you want to say about his questionable fielding, his base running, very questionable as well. Notwithstanding that great base running play he made in Game 5 of the NLDS, he was a very solid hitter, a very consistent hitter. Got over 30 doubles pretty much every year that he was healthy, and of course, what put him over the top was that 2015 postseason, which was unlike any other in baseball history. So that really was the tiebreaker and put him on the list. I looked at a few other players, and I normally don't use WAR as a tiebreaker, but I did it in this case, and that's what put Wally Backman on the team over Felix Millan. That was a tough selection, but I think Wally Backman, not only just for the way that he did, at the plate and on the field, but again, kind of another attitude player that the 86 Mets kind of needed. He was kind of a tone setter at the top of the order. So I don't think that should be certainly rewarded in terms of making a team. Felix Millan, as far as 1973, was very important. And it was unfortunate because he had an injury that really cut his career short. But was, I believe, set the record in 1973 for the most hits in a single season, and he may have broken that 2 years later. So Felix Millan was very borderline in terms of making the team. But I went with Wally Backman, and I couldn't have an argument if someone wanted to say Felix Millan.
And they've had some other good second basemen too. I mean, Doug Flynn was a very good, a good fielding second baseman who came over from the Reds.
Yeah. In the Seaver trade.
Right. So we lost Seaver, but gained Doug Flynn. And he was part of those 1980s teams, late 70s, early 80s that weren't very good, but had some decent players on it. Dave Kingman, Doug Flynn. You can go down the list. So if we head over to third base, obviously David Wright's at third base. Unfortunately, his injuries, cut his career short. But are his numbers Hall of Fame worthy because of the injury and he stopped short? Yeah. Or is it just not enough?
Yeah, I don't think it's enough. I think it's the part of the sadness that goes along with the way David Wright's career ended. I think he's securely placed among Mets greats, among maybe the top 5 greatest Mets ever. That's never going to change, and that's again, like I said, that's secure. And I look forward to when his number is retired, probably next year. That's my prediction. Since we're having Jerry Kuzman's number retired, I figured they save it for next year. But that's, to me, his Mets legacy, his legacy as an all-time Met. That is secure and never going to be questioned. But as far as being a Hall of Famer, he was certainly on a Hall of Fame trajectory up until about 2012, and as we all know, it went downhill from there, and injuries just got the better of him. Really got the better of him. It was great that he could be a part of the 2015 playoff run. Got that home run in his first at bat back in Philadelphia. Got the home run in Game 3 of the World Series, which was one of his best moments and one of the best moments in the history of Citi Field so far. But it's really too bad because it would have been great to see him just kind of see how his career could play out and see where it could have stacked up in terms of all-time great third baseman, not just all-time Met third baseman, because he's certainly number one, but would have loved to see him make the Hall of Fame, but I unfortunately think that's not going to happen.
And after that, again, you have some good players at third base: Ray Knight, Robin Ventura, Wayne Garrett, Ed Charles, Hubie Brooks.
Yeah.
How was the selection there? Was it a tough one for you?
That was a tough one, and it includes one of my final choices for the team. I put Howard Johnson
Howard
in
Johnson.
there. Howard Johnson was not the greatest fielding third baseman, but it was a fantastic hitter. He had three fantastic years, years that some of his numbers are still tops all time in Mets history. 87 was his breakout year. 89 had a fantastic year, and then 91 was his third 30-30 season, and he led the league in home runs and RBIs. It gets a little overshadowed because he always did that in years in which the Mets underachieved. 91 especially, they really collapsed at the end of the season. But it shouldn't be overlooked because he was so productive. So he deserved to make the team at third base. And behind him, I put Robin Ventura, and that might be a little bit controversial, but I thought he was not only did he produce maybe the best hitting season by a third baseman in Mets history in 1999, but he was a fantastic fielder, won a Gold Glove. His last, only played 3 years, had his last 2 years were injury plagued, but he still, fought through it and played decently. But his fielding kind of put his wins above replacement very high in terms of Mets third baseman. So that kind of allowed me to kind of put him on the team, not only because he could be the better fielder of the three, but he had a lot of big moments in 1999. We all remember the Grand Slam single, which the game was already a classic. He kind of just put an exclamation point on it. But he had a lot of great moments in leading the Mets to that postseason berth in 1999. He had some good moments as well in the World Series, the playoff run in 2000.
Have you had a chance to hear from any fans yet who have had different opinions?
So in leading up to the publication, I like on Facebook and Twitter, I put up like graphics that I created that said, "Hey, who's your all-time third baseman or left fielder or whatever position you want to name?" And it's interesting to get some the opinions of people because like we talk about second base and people are like, "Oh, what about Jeff Kent?" Like I didn't even put him on the list, and I of course knew him as watching him as a kid. I knew he was had a decent career at the Mets, and of course it really accelerated when he went on to the Giants and the Astros and the Dodgers. And I actually think he should get more consideration for the Hall of Fame. But his career as a Met was good, but not, I don't think was good enough to put on the team. So it was interesting to see also like the kind of the people that were saying that you could, I'm not saying I was judging people's ages, but you could tell like people who were maybe my age were like, "Hey, what about Jeff Kent or Alfonso?" And then maybe older people who maybe were children of the early 80s were saying, "Oh, Doug Flynn was my favorite." So everyone has an opinion, and that's the beauty of a book like this. I'm not here to kind of say here are the final choices. And that was something I made sure to mention when I did Mets and Tens, that these lists were just one fan's opinion, one very passionate fan's opinion, and I do appreciate within respectfully if people are like, "Hey, I thought that person should have been on the team," but I really like the book because if all your opinions or all of the choices that I had satisfied you, I think it would be a pretty boring book.
Right, and it's great. The book's great because it's going to open up conversations for friends and family, and you all can just sit around, have a beer, have a soda, and talk about all these different players and some of the ones that aren't on the list. I probably just mentioned I have 4 different favorite players as we're talking. I played second base, so I like Doug Flynn. He was a favorite. Yeah. Edgardo Alfonso was a favorite. So the list could probably change day to day, but stats always stay the same. So that's why it's a great book, definitely. Outfield, you chose Cleon Jones in left field, Carlos Beltran in center field, and Darryl Strawberry in right field. Mm-hmm. With everything going on with Carlos Beltran, I mean, you can't take his numbers away from him.
Yeah.
Was not my favorite player, but I mean his numbers. When you look at his numbers, they're amazing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the best offensive players in Mets history. All the other things that maybe you want to criticize him for, the 2006 NLCS strikeout. the whole injury situation he had in 2009, where he opted to get surgery on his own. A lot of fans also thought maybe he was not giving a full effort, but that was just kind of him. He just glided to balls, and he wasn't exactly he didn't give off the look that he was a hustler, but he was, he certainly gave a full effort, in my opinion. And also just what happened in the recent months with the sign stealing and then his quick removal as manager. I don't think those things should affect how he was statistically and how great he was as a Met. I mean, we talked about 41 home runs in 2006. That 2006 season, one of the best offensive seasons any Met has ever produced. And the Mets wouldn't have gotten to the NLCS without him. So I look at that strikeout, and even as a fan, shortly after that season happened, I never looked and said like, oh, I can't stand Carlos Beltran, or it didn't shape my feelings toward him. So I know some fans, they'll never get over it. For me, it was one of the most devastating losses of my life, but I don't personally go and want to just hate on Carlos Beltran because of that. So all the things that have happened to me, they certainly they will allow for people to have their own opinions. To me, it doesn't affect it. I even think he's still a Hall of Famer. I'm disappointed that he was involved in the sign stealing. However deep he may have been involved in it. Story in The Athletic said he was pretty much the ringleader of it. I don't want to say I'm doubting that, but who knows if that was just people trying to throw him under the bus. So we'll see what comes from that. But it's pretty clear that he had involvement in it. Do I think that affects his Hall of Fame chances? I don't think it really does. Maybe it'll take him a few more years to get in, and it might put a little bit of tarnish on him. But we have no proof that it made him, that he did it earlier in his career yet. I have not heard of anything like that. So to me, I still think he gets into the Hall of Fame, and frankly, I still think he gets in as a Met.
All right. So you pick different players from different decades, really, in the outfield. Darryl Strawberry in right field. I mean, that's where I grew up in the '80s with the Mets. He was awesome. He came up with Dwight Gooden, some great teams. They didn't really reach their full potential with the Mets. Mm-hmm. What was in your mind when you selected Darryl Strawberry in right field?
Yeah, no, I mean, I thought that was a no-brainer. Most home runs in Mets history, despite what we may think, and that his career was a little bit of a disappointment because his expectations were so high after being drafted number 1 in 1980 by the Mets. Everyone thought he was just going to be, kind of like Ted Williams, where he would, be a surefire Hall of Famer. And although he made, I think, 7 All-Star games, 7 straight with the Mets, again, hit the most home runs in Mets history, it still feels like we were shortchanged, and he shortchanged himself, in effect. It's great to see that he's kind of found, whatever life he wants to live. It seems like he's found some peace, mm-hmm. and he's straightened his life out, and that's great. And it's really good to see, because we never thought that was going to happen. But yeah, his career still is just one that it's one of the greatest what if careers in baseball history, and specifically with the Mets, because we all thought that maybe he was going to be possibly a career-long Met and 500 home run hitter. But in terms of Mets history, and in terms of the greatest players in Mets history, he still stands among the best, maybe in the top 5.
And left field, Cleon Jones. Could you tell us about Cleon Jones for maybe the people who don't know Cleon Jones?
Yeah. Now, Cleon Jones is probably the most important hitter of the first 2 decades of Mets history. I think, as we were talking about with Jerry Grote, if you look at Jerry Grote's hitting stats, hey, maybe it doesn't compare with other catchers of other eras. If you look at Cleon Jones, and you look at maybe like his power numbers, it doesn't line up, or it doesn't, compare favorably maybe with the Darryl Strawberry or Carlos Beltran. But back in the late 60s, when pitching was so dominant, specifically 68, the year of the pitcher, but 69, there was still a lot of dominant pitching, and hitting was a little more at a premium. But he hit 340 that year. was third in the league in batting average. And for a team in which runs were at a premium, the Mets had fantastic pitching, but runs were often hard to come by. Cleon Jones was the guy that you could count on the most. And he was so important to the success of that team, that offense, in winning the World Series. So, he had some down years, but 69 was so important. Had, 1971, he hit, over 300. 1973 was injury plagued, but he was so important and so clutch in September of that year. And that was the September in which the Mets went from last place to first place to win the National League East. And I believe he had 6 home runs in the final 10 games. So Cleon Jones, when he left the Mets, he retired shortly after he left the Mets. He went to the White Sox and pretty much was retired and really didn't have the legs to continue. Was very high up on a lot of hitting statistics in Mets history. So very, very vital to the success of the Mets, specifically in '69.
And right behind those three, you had some interesting choices. Could you talk about those?
Yeah, so left field, so the backup in left field is where I got a little creative. I had debated internally between Kevin McReynolds and Michael Conforto. The reason I had Michael Conforto as a possible left fielder is because he's still to this day has played more games there. And even through this year, if you were to play 150 games right field, he still have more games than left field. I believe so. I think it's something or close to that. But I put him in left field. And I actually went with Conforto over McReynolds because the two are so evenly matched in terms of OPS plus. Actually, Conforto is a little bit higher. Home runs, McReynolds is a little higher, but Conforto is on the verge of passing him. And in fact, I believe he's the second fastest Met to reach 100 home runs. So say what you will about his inconsistency, and I will agree to that. I think he kind of be, great one day and terrible the next. But overall, if you look at his season-long stats, he's been pretty consistent. And last year, produced his best year by far. I went with him a little bit forward thinking. Maybe it's dangerous to do that, but because they were so close, and because to be transparent, I kind of wanted this book to kind of be relevant in June or July when hopefully Conforto has had a successful first half of the 2020 season. I went with him there. As far as other outfield positions, right field had Rusty Staub. That was also part of the reason why Conforto moved to left field, because I wanted to have as Rusty Staub. I figured was a pretty solid choice for what he did for the teams in 72, 73, 75 when he was traded, and then came back and was specifically a pinch hitter and a great pinch hitter. Led the league in pinch hits and pinch hit RBIs. So he was the backup in right field. And then center field, I had 2 backups. I couldn't have a team without Mookie Wilson, who is one of many fans' favorite players and one of my favorite players, just in the great the attitude and spirit that he brought to the team. Not to mention the how quick he was and held all the stolen base and triples records before Jose Reyes. And then also, in addition to Mookie, I had Tommy Agee. We talked about Cleon Jones, how important he was to the offense of '69. If Cleon Jones is the most important offensive player, Tommy Agee is the second most important, probably. He had a great year with the bat, but also his fielding was sensational, and never more so than in Game 3 of the World Series with those 2 great catches. And everyone might forget, he hit the leadoff home run in the bottom of the first of that game. So he saved 5 runs, he produced 1 run, and the Mets won 5-0 in that game. So I made sure to include Tommy Agee because not only did he have a very good Mets career, but he had probably the greatest fielding performance by any player in World Series history.
And I was so psyched last night. I was reading the book. You mentioned my two of my favorite players, better favorite players, who not a lot of people mention as far as the greatest outfielders is Kevin McReynolds and Lee Mazzilli for honorable mention. Mm-hmm. Could you tell me about those two? You just mentioned Kevin McReynolds. He was a very good fielder in the outfield, and we talked about him coming over in that trade that might have been the downfall of his perception from the fans.
Yeah, so a good thing that you pointed out his fielding because Kevin McReynolds was a very underrated fielder. I believe he might have led the league in assists. Was an underrated stolen, base stealer. I think he stole 21 bases without getting caught, or maybe he stole all the bases he stole in '88. He did not get caught, but was a very good player. Again, certainly worthy of being on the team, but with a 30-man roster, he just kind of just missed, and was third in the MVP vote in '88. But the trade, he came over in a trade in 1987 or before the '87 season that sent Kevin Mitchell to San Diego. McReynolds had been with the Padres, but came over to the Mets. A lot of people perceive that, myself included, that chipped away at the attitude of the '62 Mets. 62, the '86 Mets, because the rest of the league was a little bit fearful, or kind of disdained the Mets because they just had this this bravado that helped them win the World Championship, and a guy like Kevin Mitchell personified that bravado. Even though he wasn't a starter, he was just kind of that guy that brought a certain attitude, along with Ray Knight, who also they got rid of in the '86 offseason. So the moves to get rid of Ray Knight and to trade Kevin Mitchell, kind of, as I said, chipped away at that attitude. And unfortunately, Kevin McReynolds, because his attitude was just kind of a little more laissez-faire. Sometimes you didn't know if he really wanted to be at the stadium. He kind of was an easy target for fans, and I think that happened late in his career with the Mets. Is that kind of his the attitude that might be perceived as lackadaisical, was to his detriment.
All right, now I have to jump back because my daughter will kill me if I don't mention her favorite player, and I skipped over shortstop. Is Jose Reyes was your selection at shortstop? Difficult choice?
No, yeah, no, not at all. I mean, second, he has the second most hits in Mets history, and probably the most exciting player the Mets have ever had. He's maybe not on the same level as a Strawberry or Good in terms of not fulfilling their full potential, because Jose Reyes is the only batting champion the Mets have ever had. But he came up a little bit short in terms of what we thought of him. Some of that was injuries, but 2005, 6, 7, and 8 were really fantastic, and then 2011 is when he won the batting championship. So to say he was not worthy of a spot on the team would be really misguided. So made sure to put him as the starter. I think it was a little bit wrong to bring him back in 2016 because he was not only a shell of his former self, but he was coming off of the domestic abuse charge. Yeah, go ahead.
Did that hurt his any fanfare of him not being on the Mets anymore at that same time that he was with David Wright? I mean, David Wright was being celebrated, and everybody loves him, and it was kind of Jose Reyes is over here. Same situation, minus the injury. He's not going to be around anymore, and it was just see you later.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think he endeared. He got great fan support while he was there. I think the fact that he left in free agency, but that really wasn't his fault. I mean, the Mets really didn't pursue him in free agency. I think a lot of people wanted to re-sign him. And it was in his right to kind of look at other offers. And when the Mets kind of said, "Oh, surprise, surprise, they weren't going to spend a lot of money," he went on to Miami. So I don't think that hurt his fan reputation at all. At least for me, the whole domestic violence thing kind of did it for me. His reputation was slightly tarnished from there, and I'm not the only one that didn't feel that. I'm not the only one that felt that he probably was not right for the Mets to take on in 2016. I don't, to me, he didn't have that much of an impact in that year, and then the 2 years after that. So I think if he didn't come back to the Mets, he still would have made the all-time team, just because those 3 years really were not anything to write home about.
Right, and right behind him, you had Buddy Harrelson, who's beloved. What do you think about him?
Yeah, in the same vein of Jerry Grody, where defense was his specialty. That was Bud Harrelson, and I made sure to include and to put emphasis on his defensive stats because, again, he was a guy who would hit eighth, and every once in a while would get a hit. But for the most part, he was in the lineup because of his fielding. And if you hear from anyone from the 69 or the 73 or the teams of Bud Harrelson's era, they will talk about how important he was. He was the glue of the defense. And, for the teams of 69 and 73 or the around that time, defense was so important to the Mets' success because they were pitching centered, they were, run prevention centered, and Bud Harrelson was in the middle and was the main cog in making sure that they kept runs off the board. In addition to Jerry Grody, but as far as being in the infield, it was Bud Harrelson, and I made sure to put some kind of sabermetric friendly stats to show that how important he was. In addition to mentioning his Gold Glove, his All-Star appearances.
And you also, I'm glad to see you mentioned Ray Ordonez as an honorable mention. Ray Ordonez, who people don't know, was just an amazing fielder. I mean, when he came up, and I can still see a play that he made in left field on a cutoff throw coming home. Could you talk about him a little bit?
Yeah, no, he was compared when he came out. I remember when he came up, he was compared to Ozzie Smith. And that first game you were talking about, I remember that was opening day, 96. It was against the Cardinals, actually Ozzie Smith's last year. And he made this play. He was taking a throw. He was like the cutoff man, taking a throw from left field. And, as the cutoff man, then threw home from his knees and got, I think it was Royce Clayton coming home. And that helped the Mets win on opening day 1996. But he made some spectacular plays, and he was not just excelled with the spectacular play, but he also made just the routine plays. I know he set a record for most consecutive errorless games. I'm trying to remember what year that was, but it was he certainly did that. I think 99 or 2000. And he was what I kind of, in a sense, what we thought he was going to be, a great fielder, not a great hitter, almost kind of a guy who hurt the Mets offensively. But kind of like Bud Harrelson was superior with the glove. We all remember that infield in 1999, the Sports Illustrated cover, considered the greatest infield ever. And he was certainly a key to making sure that was possible.
And last but not least, the manager and the front office. Could you talk about your choices there?
Yeah, so manager is one probably that I don't want to say controversial, but is probably one that people wouldn't do. But I think I was in another podcast interview, and I said I probably will get a lot of respect from the older fans. I put Gil Hodges as the manager over Davey Johnson. With all due respect to Davey Johnson, I mean that, most wins in Mets history, and if Davey Johnson was managing with the Mets today, the Mets would have made the playoffs pretty much every year he was there. But I look like in the sense of how we talked about Tom Seaver and how impactful he was when compared to Jacob DeGrom, and the attitude change that Tom Seaver had in changing the perception of the Mets. Gil Hodges did that from a managerial perspective, and probably to a greater effect than Tom Seaver did. He may be a more important figure in changing that attitude. And to me, there isn't a more important person to the success of the 69 Mets than Gil Hodges. And I don't think in with the 86 team, great talent. Davey Johnson obviously has to get a lot of credit for it, but I couldn't see another manager doing what Gil Hodges did with the 69 Mets. Mm-hmm. And so for me, that is what puts him in that spot as the all-time Mets manager.
Nice. That's a good choice. And how about general manager?
Yeah, GM, I went with, and we were just talking about the 86 Mets. The guy who built the 86 Mets was Frank Cashen. A lot of people will criticize the fact that, as we talked about with the Kevin McReynolds trade, the Kevin Mitchell trade, Kevin McReynolds for Kevin Mitchell, I should say, the Ray Knight, letting him go, and there were some other trades later on in that decade. Frank Cashen did build the team to a championship level, and of course, winning the championship in '86 from pretty much the ground floor. I mean, the team before he came on in 1980 was pretty decrepit. They had no they had no minor league talent to speak of. And then it started, by getting Darryl Strawberry with the #1 pick, then drafting Dwight Gooden in '82. They made a trade for Ron Darling. Cashin was the person who, orchestrated those deals and those trades, free agent signings that made the Mets into that perennial contender. So I couldn't see going with anyone else but Cashin.
And hot topic right now is the ownership of the Mets.
Yeah.
We could probably talk about that another time.
Yes.
But who did you pick for an owner?
Yeah, I mean, I did not pick our current owner. No, I again, when talking about the history of the Mets and talking about kind of shaping the character of the Mets, their first owner was Joan Payson, the first woman to buy a professional organization with her own money without inheriting it. She was a stakeholder in the New York Giants, and actually was had a dissenting vote in them moving to San Francisco. And she was very interested in getting a team. She came from a wealthy family, so she could buy it with her own money, and wasn't exactly a hands-on owner, but she was kind of important in kind of creating that welcoming atmosphere, not only for players, because players just adored her, but also creating that kind of family environment where fans could kind of relate to her in a sense, even though they couldn't relate to her, in terms of her bank account. They could relate her in the fact that she was a rabid fan and she cared as much, if not more, than the fans did. So that was a big influence. And of course, one of my favorite stories is that '69, she had planned this trip in like September to go to Europe. And she, like everyone else, figured, okay, in September, my team won't be in contention because they hadn't been in contention in their first, since '62. And of course, the Mets start winning in the summer, and they become a contender in the NL East. And she decides to go on the trip because she doesn't want to jinx the team, which I think anyone who has any bit of superstition in their bones would do the same thing. So he was really one of us, notwithstanding the fact that he had a deep bank, some deep pockets.
Are you concerned with the status of the sale of the Mets?
I think it will all work out. I've never I've never been in any kind of deep negotiations or serious negotiations when it comes to money. My feeling is that whatever is going on in terms of Steve Cohen backing out might be some kind of a negotiating ploy. But I can't. I don't know. I have no experience on this whatsoever. So I feel eventually it will work out. And from what we're hearing, from what we're hearing, it seems like the Wilpons and those associated with the Wilpons in the ownership are willing to give a little bit more, and that should allow for a sale in the next few months, I'm sure.
Well, again, this is Brian Wright. He's the author of the New York Mets All-Time All-Stars. Trust me, I read the book myself. Anybody who loves baseball or the Mets, you should definitely go out and get this book. It's available on Amazon right now. I know that's where I went, paperback or digital. Anything else you want to add, Brian? Where can we find you?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at BrianWright86. You can we'll post excerpts from the book, critical acclaim from the book. I was really happy to get some blurbs from Tom Verducci, from former Mets like Howard Johnson and John Matlack. So you'll see some of that. I'll post just kind of random Met stuff if something happened on a particular day, or just my general thoughts about the Mets. But if you're interested in a signed copy, feel free to direct message me, and I'll be happy to get back to you and be happy to sign a book and send it your way.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate you coming on with me. It was great.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was great, Ryan. Thanks so much for having me on.
No problem. This is our year, Brian. This is it.
I say that every year. I feel a little bit better this year. Fingers crossed. Fingers crossed. I'm living here in Washington, D.C. I had to go through watching the Nationals win the World Series, and I had to kind of go on radio silence in terms of social media because I couldn't stand seeing my friends celebrate. And I also couldn't stand some of my friends who probably couldn't name 3 Nationals players talking about how great it was for, us to win. And I equate that to jumping into the marathon at mile 26. Like for someone like me who's spent my whole life wanting to see my team win a World Series and for them to just be celebrating. I know it doesn't mean as much to them as it would have been for the Mets to win for me. It's hard to take. So a Mets World Championship, whether it's this year or soon, would alleviate that feeling of last year.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you, Brian.
Thanks so much, Ryan.
Everything. I appreciate it.
I really appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.